going to share some reflections which I prepared, and let me start by basically valuing what you're doing, because one of the great deficits of Egypt of today is the fact that we do not have an informed debate. What we get to witness as citizens living in Egypt, or Egyptians following, or non-Egyptians following events in Egypt from afar, is that we are seeing a public space which has been, to a great extent, misshaped since 2013. So we do not have a free flow of information. We can underline that very fact of lacking any free flow of information in relation to different events. We see public space which is centered around media outlets that are either directly controlled by the security apparatus or indirectly controlled by the security services. Questions of public and private ownership really do not make a big difference. Public and private owned media outlets are controlled in terms of what they report, what they highlight. There's a great deal of false news, post-truth issues going on in Egypt. I believe we've been trendsetter long before Trump and his campaign in the US. We lack informed debates in Egypt, and one of the clear issues where we see that lack of and the grave impact of lacking an informed debate among interested citizens is when it comes to the presidential elections in 2018. So I really value keeping a forum accessible for Egyptians or non-Egyptians interested in Egypt living abroad in Mayadeen and around Mayadeen. I believe we have, once again, aside from the presidential elections, Egyptians living abroad ought to consider what to do. There are very interesting ideas about exile politics in exile. It's new to us, Egyptians. We haven't experienced that before. It's the first time that we do have qualified diaspora of Egyptians outside of Egypt. Maybe the only time frame I keep trying to read about is the second half of the 1970s, as a tiny number of Egyptian, relative to what we're seeing right now, tiny number of Egyptian intellectuals left Egypt and went to places as different as Kuwait City, Beirut, London, and elsewhere. But this time we really have an influx, an exodus, and therefore an influx in exile of Egyptians. So we ought to consider what we can do to keep us informed and to help and to engage, in spite of the difficulty of being remotely engaged and not on the ground. So let me now come to why the presidential elections 2018 matter, and I have 5 ideas which I would like to run by you, and then we can get started in our debate. Number one, idea number one is that the elections 2018, and in spite of the fact that we do have a repressive framework, a repressive legal framework, a repressive political framework, that the elections 2018 still matter. So why do they still matter? They still matter because big events in politics, even in authoritarian polities, and Egypt is a clear case of an authoritarian polity. If we define authoritarian polities by polities where we have a ruling establishment that is not willing to share power, that is definitely the case. If we define it by referring to a ruling establishment that is not willing to accept rotation of power via the ballot box, it's exactly what we have. If we refer to authoritarian polities by saying, well, here is one ruling establishment controlling the business of law-making and the business of law enforcement and law implementation and using them to the extent of entrenching itself and its control in the social fabric. It's exactly what we have been seeing since 2013. If we refer to authoritarian polities as polities where we have an accumulation of human rights abuses and violations, it's what's happening in Egypt as well. However, in authoritarian polities, big events such as elections still matter. They do not matter because they bring us closer to rotation of power or to power sharing, because most probably, as we are sitting right here, no matter what kind of constellation in the presidential elections will emerge, who is going to run, who is not going to run, what kind of competition we'll have, we probably, all of us, can already say that, well, the results are quite well known ahead of the time of the elections. However, they do matter because they represent possibilities, big events such as elections, bring in possibilities of pushing the envelope a bit further, or of opening an entry point which we cannot see before. Pushing the envelope means that we can, and I believe it's safe to assume, of course it's a question of the conditions in which the presidential elections will take place, but it's safe to assume that in any election, as authoritarian as the elections may be managed, that some entry points emerge of more debate, more information gets circulated, more ideas get to be addressed to citizens, more communication about politics happen. So events, big events such as elections attract attention. And via the central tool of attracting attention, entry points of engaging citizens, of running some ideas by citizens, of claiming back some spaces which the authoritarian polity did claim and took away from Egyptians since 2013 is possible. So elections do matter, be it elections in trade unions and syndicates, they do matter. And I refer you to, in fact, some of the very important events in Egyptian politics since 2013 have been related to elections in trade unions, primarily in professional associations, in the syndicate of the press, in the journalist syndicate. I mean, the shift from the pro-democracy board, elected board, into more of a regime-controlled board, that happened, and all of the discussion centered around it via the tool of having to organize elections in the syndicate of journalists. Before that, the dynamism of the syndicate of medical doctors, which led to, in fact, the biggest, in terms of numbers, the biggest meeting in Egypt, public meeting in Egypt since 2013, up until today, happened within the headquarters of the Syndicate of Medical Doctors. The General Assembly meeting, which came into being after cases of personnel of the police harassing medical doctors while medical doctors were performing their duties. So, and that was related to the fact that we had an elected board which mobilized and called for a general meeting, and that general meeting happened and created some dynamism in the Egyptian political scene. So elections do lead to the creation of entry points, even without knowing what the results are going to be, without knowing what kind of conditions we are going to face. They bring in some mobility which otherwise do not exist. And let us remember what has been happening in Egypt since 2015 in terms of political actions. So we've been, since 2015, we've been saying, away from the regime, away from what the regime has been doing, we've been saying, to my mind, three patterns of actions on the ground, political actions on the ground. One is activism. Citizens taking to the street or taking to public spaces in work facilities or otherwise to protest, be it for bread and butter issues, workers, civil servants. The last case is holders of MA degrees protesting in front of the Ministry of Higher Education, demanding that they get appointed. We had scores of protest activities by workers, by civil servants. This is one pattern of what we've been seeing since 2013. And facing that pattern, the government has been coming in using its repressive tools and a bit of domestication. So a bit of giving in, increasing salaries here and there, but mainly the government has responded using its repressive tools. So transferring protesting workers to tribunals, in at least one case, which is the case of the Alexandria shipyard, to military tribunals, or basically declining any requests or any claims. So the government has responded using its repressive tools, and that repressive tool has been put well in place via different legal amendments that have been introduced since 2015, like the protest law and other laws. The second pattern is activism centered around what I call safe havens, in the sense of here we are looking into a quasi-institutional space. So, for example, the Syndicate of Medical Doctors, the Syndicate of Journalists, or on campuses of public universities. Here we've been seeing different protest dynamics, sometimes driven by clear demand, sometimes less driven by clear demands. And here too the government has tried to respond via tightening up its security control. So a pro-democracy elected board gets removed, a pro-government elected board comes in. And of course it was not only by coercion. I mean, they used the tool of financial promises. I mean, the pro-government elected board came in because it promised greater benefits to journalists. And traditionally in Egypt, once you are close to the government, you get more benefits. I mean, anti-government elected boards and syndicates are not looked at preferably. Pro-government elected boards are looked at preferably. In universities, the government changed laws and regulations pertaining to public universities to basically criminalize peaceful protest activities and impacted a great deal of disciplinary measures, all the way from pushing students out, firing staff members, faculty, and so on and so forth. Trying to tighten up, and of course bringing in private security and bringing back police presence on campuses, despite of the famous ruling of the State Council in 2010, before 2011, of university campuses not to be overseen by police personnel. So here too, in the quasi-institutional spaces, the government has responded primarily using its repressive tools. And if you look at the numbers, both pattern one, workers, civil servants, and students, as well as syndicate members, quantitatively, protest activities have been declining. So, if I count right, we are looking at a decline of 40% between 2014 and 2016. And by the way, we no longer have numbers because no one can report as they reported accurately in 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15. So even numbers for 2017 are not in yet. One of the great websites for anyone who is working on activism in Egypt is the democracy meter, مؤشر الديمقراطية. So they try to keep account, but it's not as easy to know. The third pattern of actions, political actions on the ground, has been centered around political parties, political agents. For example, some of them were driven by the two-island issue, Tiran and Sanafir, where political parties, political agents called for demonstrations and tried to push forward a clear set of demands related to that matter. Political parties, groups such as the Democratic Canon, in which 6 parties are represented, or different parties such as the Dustur or the Aish wal-Hurriya of Khalid Ali, have been trying to engage in some political actions as well. When you look at the details, the government has responded repressively, and in fact responded by using other tools as well, trying to limit the space of maneuvering given to political parties. What you were referring to, Dina, for example, not enabling political parties not represented in parliament to exist in a legal manner anymore. So parties which are not represented in parliament, and keep in mind, parliament is completely controlled. The outcome of the election was completely masterminded by the security services. So you're trying to delegalize existing political parties which are not represented in parliament because you control representation in parliament. So the government has responded to political parties and their actions via additional tools besides repression to limit the space given to political parties to operate in legalities. Political parties are legal entities. Political parties do not operate in closed rooms. Political parties have to operate in legal spheres. So if you limit the sphere of legality, you basically, in fact, push political parties into a ridiculed form of existence, which is exactly happening. We have over 100 parties in Egypt. In the last survey conducted by Basira, I guess most asked could remember only the name of 3 parties out of 100, which is always a good indicator. So you push parties to a ridiculed form of existence by limiting their space of legal operation. Secondly, of course, going after activists in parties. I mean, if you only count the number of arrested activists in Aish wal-Hurriya, in Dustur, in Masr, or in other parties, that has been part of a very targeted government policy. So these 3 patterns of political actions have been unfolding away from the government in the Egyptian public space, as repressive, as limited as it is. So Now, when you look at elections may, A, without knowing, or even while knowing the results, while knowing that we will not get to power sharing or rotation of power in any meaningful manner. Big events such as elections can, A, increase the vital, or add to the energy of these existing patterns of action, so can revitalize activism among workers, among civil servants, can revitalize activism in syndicates on university campuses, and can definitely revitalize political parties. Political parties are in search of a topic, of an issue. I mean, how can you come across to citizens if you don't have an agenda, if you don't have a platform? Not agenda as it's used in the pro-government press and media. So I shouldn't mention that word. So backtracking, okay, so that's number one. Idea number one. So elections matter. The second idea is, while I'm saying elections matter, it's quite important to keep in mind that elections happen in environments which are structured by constitutional, legal, political, and of course government administrative measures. So it's important. Second idea is to look at the conditions. How can we push for better conditions for the contestation in 2018? And here are different sub-ideas which I would like to flag. Number one, if you do not run in elections, you stand no chance of arguing for shaping the environment in which the elections happen. I mean, you cannot say, I'm boycotting the elections and say, well, but unless the elections are transparent, clean, and pluralist, and unless legal condition A, B, and C are met, it makes no sense. It's more effective to do so while you are in it. And you can always attach that to a conditionality. If I am running, for example, a candidate can announce that she or he is running and saying, well, attached to a set of conditions. If she or he runs, she or he would like to see human rights violations and abuses tackled by means of holding accountable those who are implicated or might be implicated in human rights abuses and violations, and calling for accountability. One can say I'm addressing my conditions to the legal framework in which the elections happen, and monitor right now what the High Election Commission is doing, because right now they are sitting. The High Election Commission has come into being. Its formation has been announced a few weeks ago. It's populated by primarily judges, and they are working on regulations. Are we engaging with them in any manner? Are we putting forward a set of demands with regard to how to regulate the election process itself? That needs to be done. Secondly, you can say my conditions are of a wider political nature. I would like the government to address the issue of Egyptians detained for political purposes. I would like the government to address the issue of defamation of opposition figures, of limiting the space of legality for parties, opposition parties, and so on and so forth. Or one can take issue with, which should happen, one can take issue with what the government has impacted on the ground in the last 4 or 5 years. For example, one can take issue with the laws that this government has been putting in place, the state of emergency, which has been declared once and again, 6 months, and then declared for a new round, and these rounds can go endlessly. So the second idea is, while participating in the elections, one can always link participation to a set of conditions. And those conditions can be directly related to the election process itself, be it in the legal sense or in the political sense, for example, or in the operational sense. What about media coverage for election candidates? What kind of time on TV, time on radio, and so on and so forth? What is the cap on funding? I mean, the last time we had presidential and parliamentary elections, there was no clarity whatsoever on who spent what, of course, on the government side. I mean, everyone else was either not running in the presidential elections, or in the case of Hamdin Sabahi, I guess he did announce his funding and the sources of his funding. That needs to be tackled as well, not only for opposition candidates, but for the pro-regime or regime candidates. So you can always attach your conditions to the election process itself, legally, politically, operationally, or you can put forward a set of wider, which is very legitimate by the way, a set of wider conditions, tackling the wider political issue, asking before running in the elections for fixes for the question of human rights abuses and violations. Maybe you will not get it, but in that case you entered into a debate, you made your demand, and if the government does not respond, you can always say, well, I'm not running because that demand was not met. But you made an issue. I mean, right now we are not making an issue, we're talking in closed rooms. And even what we write, I mean, those who read us, I mean, you read us, those who are pro-democracy, or in a very wide sense, the democracy movement in Egypt, be it inside Egypt or outside of Egypt, we are reaching that point of a completely closed discussion. We are talking with each other. We are not moving beyond our circles. We are not moving beyond the layers which we already know. So you need to break that, and once again, you can break it by running in the elections, where we all once again know that the results are a priori decided upon. That this is not going to be a practice of contestation of power, democratic contestation of power. That state institutions are going to interfere in a substantial manner. All of that we do know. However, we can tie running in the elections to two sets of conditions, one related to the election process, and by that making it clear to Egyptians why these conditions matter. You know, I have always experienced how hard it is to bring to citizens why election parameters, why details of the election process matter, why it does matter, for example, not to use, back then in 2011, in the parliamentary elections which I had, why it does matter not to use places of worship for political purposes. Why not to run election campaigns in mosques or in churches or wherever, in whatever place of worship. You need to attach it to the event. Citizens will not understand, will not be able to understand our generic talk about how important it is to get transparent and fair and free elections. It's only when they are faced with the event itself that it makes sense. I mean, you can say, look, I mean, here is airtime for the regime candidate of 1 hour every day. And for opposition candidates, they are not even getting 5 minutes every day. Whatever, but you will have that tool in your hand. And secondly, the wider conditions are very legitimate. And I know there is some discussion in different pro-democracy political parties and platforms which are emerging. Should the conditions which they are going to announce in relation to candidacy in the presidential election, should the conditions be only related to the election process or wider? And I do not mind having wider conditions. And as long as you can make a battle, as long as you can make a political battle based on that. Fine, so conditions. Third idea on the elections. Now, politics, even in authoritarian countries, political interactions, political dynamics are always structurally, are always centered and built in around irregularities. There are built-in surprises in politics, even in authoritarian politics. I'm not going to refer you to the case of Pinochet and Chile and the elections. You probably did, some of you at least did watch the documentary, the great documentary on the presidential elections in Chile. So, all parliamentary elections in different authoritarian countries have brought in some surprises, unexpected surprises from a regime perspective, irregularities. So as tight, the third idea, as tight as the authoritarian environment in Egypt may be as of now, and it's really tight. It's tight legally, and even it's tight legally in the sense of undermining constitutional safeguards for freedoms and rights. It's tight politically because we have only one center of gravity, which is the executive branch of government controlled by the military and security component, and whatever else in the state apparatus serves the executive branch of government in a very clear manner. It's very tight administratively because this government has been investing a lot in coming up with new administrative tools to control society. I mean, they are not, this is not a chaotic type of governing. This is a very systematic type of authoritarian governing, creating not only new legal realities or tightening up the control of the executive branch of government over parliament and over other authorities, but as well, or oversight bodies. I mean, look at what happened to the judiciary, or look at what happened to the Central Auditing Agency, and so on and so forth. But this is a government which has been very creative in inventing new administrative tools of controlling society, of pushing citizens away. So as tight as this environment may be in Egypt, irregularities from a regime perspective, surprises from our perspective, cannot be ruled out. Elections, even if we say, well, definitely we know the results, there is always some room of maneuvering. There is always some, and unless you try out, unless you get into that messy process of running against a regime candidate in a tight environment, in an authoritarian environment, you will not tap into these potential possibilities. For example, from the Egyptian contemporary history, not going to Chile, not going to different cases of democratic transition, which we do study in political science. In Egypt, for example, there were at least 2 sets of parliamentary elections where results before 2011, where the results were not expected. The more recent example was 2005. The parliamentary elections of 2005, wherein, of course, elections were organized in 3 phases. Phase 1 ended up with the Muslim Brotherhood winning close to more than 60 seats, if I'm not mistaken, in phase 1. And then phase 2 and phase 3 brought them up all the way to 88, right? It was 88 seats. And that was clearly, from a regime perspective, a clear case of irregularity. And go back to the discussions which we had back then. This was a very tight environment with terrible constitutional amendments, with a state of emergency and a highly repressive state, and so on and so forth. And however, 88 seats could be contested, could be won. The earlier case in Egypt, and of course I'm not referring to Egypt prior to 1952, the earlier case was in 1976. So the first parliamentary elections organized when late President Sadat moved from a one-party system into a semi-pluralist setting. We ended up having a relatively big representation of the Tagammu, of the leftist platform, to the extent that when Sadat signed the peace treaty with Israel, he needed to dissolve parliament because of the 40+ members of the opposition bloc. They were not accounted for. This was not part of the planning. So what I'm saying is, as strict as any authoritarian design of how to manage elections may be, there are always opportunities. There are always possibilities. Now, the question is a question which needs to be responded to, and here's idea number 4, which is, this is basically not an issue where we can fault ourselves, where we can claim that any one of us possesses the ultimate right answer. We simply do not know, and we have to tolerate that. So we have to tolerate that while I am pushing for participation with conditions, I do not mind at all that anyone, even among the group in which I'm active in, politically, or friends, associates, like-minded Egyptians, would say, well, no, I mean, this is not about running and we should stay away. Fine, if anyone feels like boycotting, if these ideas, if they find the boycott option, if they find that it has more merits, we should not get ourselves into the business of disowning or disqualifying or delegitimizing or even simple bad talk about choices. These are very tough environments. And in tough environments, we should only try to be modest and stop putting even more burden on our shoulders. We are already facing an autocratic giant with different tools, constitutional, legal, administrative, operational, the power of the purse, who gets what. I mean, this is, and even if it is in reality not as strong, but it's a state which would like to create that image of the almighty state, the almighty government. So why should we waste our limited energy in such a tough environment arguing among each other about what's right and what's wrong? There is no ultimate right and there is no ultimate wrong. Boycott is as legitimate as participation. All what I'm saying is, if you boycott, have an idea of why you're boycotting for. Make a battle about, say you are boycotting because of A to B to C to D to whatever. And try to make it public, try to engage citizens. I believe boycott is not attractive. It's my personal belief based on experiences which I went through in Egypt, because we had I personally called for participation in the election referendum, some history, 2011 on the constitutional amendments. And we were, many of you will remember that the non-religious, the secular, be it liberal, leftist camp, did have a real battle inside its movements and actors about whether to boycott or to participate. The same debate happened again in parliamentary elections. The same debate happened again, not in the presidential election, because we had representation from presidential elections 2012. The same debate happened again in the constitutional referendum 2012, the Ikhwan and Salafi constitution, and all the way to 2013 I was on the side of participation no matter what, because this was an open environment. I myself did not see a great merit to participate in the constitutional referendum in 2014 or in the presidential or parliamentary elections later on. But I respected those who went out and voted, or went out and ran, or went out in the presidential elections like Hamdin Sabahi and tried to contest. So these are tough environments, and we cannot claim that any one of us has the right answer. This is an issue which needs to be decided upon inside movements, inside actors, and no matter where we end, it needs to be respected. We should not waste a great deal of our energy or make bad blood about ideological debates of ultimately is it right or wrong to participate or boycott. It goes in the two ways. Final idea is a question which I would like to address, which is the main argument of boycotting, not running, is the argument of we should not engage in legitimizing an undemocratic, autocratic government. Now, we really have to step back and look at what this concept of legitimacy really does mean in Egyptian reality as of now. We are in year 5 after 2013. This government has been recognized globally, not only regionally. This is a recognized government. I do not like it. I dislike that the Egyptian government is not pushed to respect standards of human rights. However, the Egyptian government is recognized. This government is recognized globally. So the first layer of the legitimacy question is we should not legitimize a government which is not recognized globally. This government is recognized. So whether we participate or do not participate in the elections will not add up in any meaningful manner to changing that equation. And of course, one can always talk about, well, how bad political realities are, but they are what they are. I mean, politics and political realities are about interests, and there are a great deal of interests with Egypt, and it's only justifiable from a US perspective or German perspective or French perspective to deal and wheel with the undemocratic government of Egypt, because there are vital interests at stake. And I believe for us Egyptians, boycotting this government wouldn't help. It wouldn't help. I mean, I'm always reminded of the North Korean example. Disengagement, boycotting led to where? To more repression, to more human rights violations, to not, in fact, actually the word opinion, global opinion, not knowing what's happening inside North Korea. So, but in fact, one is this a recognized, an internationally recognized government. The only regional actor which did not recognize this government was the African Union for a few months, and then it shifted its policy. Number 2, this is a government, realistically, and I am an opponent to this government for different reasons. Many of them are related to democracy, some of them are related to its social and economic policies, and so on and so forth. And some of them are related to the initiation. I do not recognize what happened on July 3rd, 2013. However, this government has a considerable amount of support in Egypt. We are in a divided society, and this government commands support of a stable constituency. Once again, whether we like it or dislike it, we have to find out a way. We cannot run any meaningful process of transformation toward greater freedom, better respect of human rights, greater participation of citizens in public affairs, unless we factor in the fact that this is an authoritarian government, but it's a popular authoritarian government. It has some popular backing. And it's not only in Egypt. There are many authoritarian rulers around which are popular. I dislike it, by the way. And I find it very hard to teach to my students right now at Stanford. So how come are those bloody authoritarian governments as popular, that popular? Historically speaking, we have had cases of authoritarian governments in the region and in Egypt which were popular. Abdel Nasser is a case in point. So this is a divided society, and this is a government which does command support among considerable segments of the population. It's a divided society. Third point, having that in mind, going to the elections will not result in a voter turnout of 5%, which would disqualify and delegitimize the process. You would end up having, just like last time, a voter turnout around 30%, you can push it to 40%, whatever manipulation will happen. But as long as you don't have a really, really tiny voter turnout, it's very difficult to then, after the election process, say, well, this is a completely flawed and not an illegitimate election process. If we are not sure that we will get to stop the voter turnout at 5%, you cannot claim that this is an illegitimate election process, because the voter turnout is going to be more. And once again, historically speaking, Egyptians, apart from 2011, 2012, were always reluctant to go to the polling centers. Voter turnout has always, historically speaking, even by the way, before 1952, has always been in the 30s, around 30–40%. You cannot make an argument. If it's what they are going to get, you cannot say, well, illegitimate process. No, you have enough voter turnout to say, well, here is a real contestation which happened. So I do not believe that we can delegitimize the process by boycotting the elections. That it's more meaningful to try to figure out how to run. And this is only not a question of who, but it's a question of the platform. To relate running in the elections to two sets of conditions, election-related and wider political environment-based, and to try to engage citizens in a dire situation where we haven't been able to engage citizens in a meaningful manner since 2013. And the other option, while I completely respect it, and I'm going to respect anyone who pushes to even ahead of the election cycle for boycott, I do not believe that ultimately when you boycott, you try to delegitimize. This is what political actors do anywhere. You boycott election because you say, well, I would like to showcase that this is an illegitimate election. I don't believe that we are in any manner close to getting that realistically, which is why my argument is to participate based on a clear vision of why we're participating, why we're trying to get, and it goes without saying that we should not sort of come across in the Egyptian public space as dreaming of power sharing or rotation of power as of now. The discourse related to running in the elections, contesting the presidential elections, has to be a reality-based discourse. No one, as I was saying, there are always irregularities from regime perspective, surprises from our perspective, but we cannot propagate our position based on, here you go, citizen, go and vote in the elections and we will have a change in the presidential palace. Most probably we will not get a change in the presidential palace. But we should say we are running to make a political battle for issues, for a clear platform. Here's what I have to say.
Thank you.
Into that business of creating tight authoritarian environments and putting on opposition non-regime affiliated groups the burden of figuring out what to do, and then they already know. So if you're going to put forward conditions, they know how to tackle that. If you're saying, well, we participate, but if conditions are not met, we will get out, it means they know how to manage that. This is an important question because in previous cases, the regime was very successful in fact, playing on that to ridicule opposition parties. Well, they are putting forward conditions which are unrealistic. I mean, how can we meet them? And so bringing in sometimes a time frame. I mean, how can we release detained Egyptians in such a short time frame? How can we do it without due process? And so they ridicule political groups as well. So it's important to think about it. And second is a question of organization. So I mean, the question of are we organized enough? I mean, is there a we? First of all, is there a we? Because one of the legacies of authoritarian regimes is that you don't have a we. I mean, they are so. I mean, it's not only about divide and rule, but they mastermind the process of always creating fragments. I mean, so that they are at the end of the day faced with fragments of an opposition spectrum. So one, is there a we? Secondly, and if there is a we, is that we organized enough to contest presidential elections, or for that matter, later parliamentary elections or local elections in the tight environment we have in Egypt as of now? I myself, I mean, the way I think about it, but once again, I mean, I know that there are many people who look at it quite differently. I believe that big events in politics are to be used for organization. That you cannot demand that we to exist ahead of time. It never happens. You can spend time in closed rooms, right, debating what kind of common interests we do have. There's a great German word which is Schnittmengen, which is when you sit, and so between 2011 and 2013, I always had this word in mind. So you sit Islamists and non-Islamists, liberal leftists. So what is it that we agree on? Unless you have a concrete issue you're debating, for example, the Constituent Assembly, the formation of the Constituent Assembly in 2011. Unless you have concrete topics you're debating, we can move on generically forever. And we will not know where we agree and where we disagree. So, point one is, I believe big events like elections help to create that we. Look, for example, once again, so I was referring to elections in the two syndicates, medical doctors or doctors, because I guess technically they are not only medical doctors. So, doctors and journalists. Board elections, in the two cases, were in fact a great crystallization point of that we, and we emerged and yielded a pro-democracy board in the syndicate of journalists before it was ousted and removed in the last elections. And it still has in place a pro-democracy board in the syndicate of doctors. So that we was created in the event itself. So secondly, I do not believe that if we go on without any ties to concrete events out there in Egypt's political calendar, that we can dream of getting better organization. What does organization mean politically for a political party or a set of political actors? Organization means one, that you develop a platform, an idea. So we can call it a discourse, a platform, a program, whatever. A programmatic sort of message to communicate. What am I standing for? What do I like to get? What do I like to see in Egypt? And not only politically, because once again, one of the great legacies of between 2011 and 2013 is you cannot feed people constitutional debates and political debates forever. It means there are social and economic issues which are pressing in a poor country like Egypt. So what do we stand for? So this is a chance to clear that. Clear it to an extent by way better than what you get away from elections. And I refer all of us to the fact, I mean, check any website of any political party in Egypt. You will not find any clear programmatic statement. And because I write, I mean, I always check them. Right? You will not find a single clear programmatic statement. The only one, to be honest, comes from Al-Aish wa Hurriya, party initiative to register a party of bread and freedom. And it's a programmatic statement related to the IMF deal the Egyptian government signed and its social and economic impacts. But elections are a great place to put forward programmatic statements and programmatic messages and to test them. Are we popular or in the tight environment, as tight as it may be. So organization means messages, coining messages. Organization, secondly, means outreach. We are not able to reach out to Egyptian citizens away from big events. Taking to the street means potential detention, punishment. Just monitor what has been happening to party members of الدستور, العيش والحرية, مصر القوية, and everyone else throughout the last 4 years. So we can use the event to reach out, to better organize. Finally, organization in tight environments like Egypt means as well finding your potential allies. Some would take it all the way to potential allies within the ruling establishment or potential allies away from the ruling establishment. But you've got to test that too. I need to know where I'm standing. Fine. So that is why as weak as the organization of opposition actors is as of now, and it's a reality, I believe the elections, we stand a chance of getting into a higher level, a higher degree of organization. It will not be a quick fix, but it's a gradual process. We are in a very tight environment. Secondly, so boycott is, of course, easier. Yes, because, I mean, what does it take? I mean, the message is simple, do not go. I mean, this is a sort of activism by negation. A big event, you're steering away from that big event. So activism by negation is always easier than activism by participation. Active participation. I mean, boycott is a form of participation too. But it's, you basically stay away. What you lose, however, while boycotting is fine. I mean, the big objective is, as you were saying, well, to make it an illegitimate practice of democratic contestation, which is A, voter turnout. Before voter turnout, candidates, I mean, if you have only one candidate, what kind of contestation is that, and so on and so forth. What we know from Egypt is it really goes away very quickly. I mean, you have it for 1 day. I mean, yes, there was a third day. I was in Egypt back then, right? And they were going through different neighborhoods using megaphones, saying, well, لابد من المشاركة في الانتخابات. And they were threatening. I guess they were threatening 500. Right? 500. Okay, 500. Fine. So how did they end? They ended up, we do not know the real voter turnout. This is one of the legacies of authoritarianism. We do not possess enough information to say whether the figures they put forward are right or wrong. But they brought it all the way up to 40% plus. It was 42, 43, if I remember correctly. A bit of discussion for 2-3 days, a week, and completely gone. Domestically, as well as internationally. So, are we happy with getting that once again? Okay. And then your final point, backfiring. Running an opposition candidate who ends up, she or he, being ridiculed and landing 5% or even less. I mean, because the last time it was pro-regime candidate, boycott, and finally the opposition candidate. I mean, we had 2 candidates and the opposition candidate came third. So really ridiculing the man. So is it a risk? Yes, it's a risk. Can we mitigate it? Yes, we can mitigate it. I believe we can mitigate it by being honest in what we communicate. This is not about power, about rotation of power. This is not about changing who sits in the presidential palace. I believe we should agree on putting forward a very realistic discourse, messages which state clearly that it's about participation attached to conditions, election process based and wider conditions. And if we decide to go on all the way to the election day, no one should claim that he or she, the opposition candidate, can win big. I mean, it should be modest, it should be honest, and citizens should be invited to know why. I mean, you know, the missing element is Hamdin Sabahi ended up having less than 5%? 3%. And there was no discussion about how come he ended up having that 3%. Even his platform didn't try to make a good discussion of it. I mean, the guy was defamed in the press for a long time. He was discredited politically, ideologically, personally, and so on and so forth. He did not stage a battle before the election day, but he even did not stage a battle after the election day. This time we should be aware of the fact if you end up having the same treatment of defamation, we should stage a battle after it. And they control conventional media. We have pro-democracy voices in social media everywhere. You can stage a battle. I mean, just for it, compare, and I'm going to stop it so that we have more questions. Compare, for example, how social media and social media activists have been very effective in specific cases of police brutality. طلعت شبيب in الأقصر, the guy of Cairo in الضرب الأحمر. شو كانوا وليد؟ Social media basically undermines the government rhetoric in an evening. And comes the next day, the Minister of Interior had to apologize, the government had to promise accountability, and the Talat Shabib, the officer implicated in the killing of Talat Shabib, was sentenced finally, the final instance, okayed the verdict sentencing him to 3 years in, so I'm not happy about anyone going to prison, I'm just saying here is a political case. And then you end up, after weeks of campaigning, the presidential elections happen, a great deal of irregularities. The third day was laughable, I mean, the extension day. And then you do not stage a battle after it, because, well, I lost, so I'm retiring back home. This is how you approach it. So, yeah, I mean, once again, I do not mind, I honestly do not mind. I believe, Dina, you're right about the first point. They know how to manage it, they know how to mastermind it. It's time that we find more creative ways of engaging. So I believe battles in autocratic environments are not one shot and off you go. These are prolonged issues. You do not stop with the announcement of the election results. You need to have a long, I mean, they operate based on the fact, well, we are the giant in the room, and we are facing fragments of opposition, and they are short-lived. This is one of the legacies of Egypt's opposition. It's all short-lived. It's quick flare, and it disappears. We need to reconsider that. So the first constitutional referendum we had was in March 2011, and the yes vote was close to 80%, 78, and 78, and right?
Yes,
yeah, exactly. And so the no vote, which the secular constituency pushed for to a great deal, was around 22%. So whatever happens between 2011 and 2012, and then we come to a second constitutional referendum. Big debate back then in the secular camp whether we boycott or participate. And of course, back then, I was, as I said, I was in favor of participation, because this was an open field, different deficiencies, but there was a democratic practice. I mean, we disliked the results, and there were different deficits, but this was a pluralist practice. If not completely democratic, there was some pluralism really on the ground. And then before going to the constitutional referendum, after agreeing on yes in the secular camp, I pushed exactly, and so that where was in the National Salvation Front? The vote before, the no vote was 22%. I said if we go up from 22, the no vote, because we were voting the constitutional draft down for different reasons. You remember the debate. So about issues pertaining to Sharia, Article 241, and what have you. So I said it's a democratic practice. If we push up the no vote from 22 to 30%, 35, we are the big winner of that constitutional referendum. This is part of the democratic practice. We should not go out and say, well, we were wrong about participating and should have boycotted. The message should be, look, we added to our constituency 12% of the Egyptian electorate. It's how you do it, right? And, of course, the election, the constitutional referendum happens, the results get announced, and the no vote was close to 38%. So even more. And what happened was complete fiasco on the side of the National Salvation Front. Instead of going out and saying, well, we pushed it up from 22 to 37, 38, what the message communicated was flawed process, and we dislike it, and boycotting, whatever else will come. And that was not right, because when you are in it, you should be in it to make a good argument for the fact that you have been in it. And it was a big win. You added 14%, which is not tiny. Right? So this is exactly what you need. So the last time it was 3%. If you go to 15%, define that as your realistic goal, given the autocratic environment we're having. Fine. So this is a very good point. I mean, this is exactly, I mean, you give a great example for how to approach it realistically. Do not push forward 55%. We will not get 55%. Even in a democratic, in a complete democratic contestation, we will not get 55%. There are real segments, considerable segments, which dislike what we say about democracy, which dislike what we say about human rights, which care more about getting bread and butter issues and do not believe that anyone else but the ruling establishment can deliver bread and butter to their family dining tables. We should be a bit modest. This is the legacy of operating in an autocratic environment. They know that we are a bunch of chaotic activists too. I mean, we do not have a clear discourse, and unless we come across with a clear discourse, we're getting nowhere. And I think this is the self-criticism we have to practice, and the event we need to use. Now, to the question of Said. So, if you monitor Egyptian debates, and so I'm obsessed with classification. This is what I was trained to do. So there are, and sometimes it's part of looking at reality. Sometimes it disguises more than it reveals. But anyhow, so bear with me to give you my classification for the candidate. So monitoring Egyptian debates, I see three approaches, responses to what kind of candidate are we looking for. Approach one is get a candidate to whom the potential votes of the second giant can be given. Who is the second giant? The Muslim Brotherhood. So the whole debate about Sami Anan is exactly approach one, which is get an opposition candidate to whom the votes of the second giant, because this is Egyptian politics, has always been structured about the two giants, the army and the Muslim Brotherhood, get the votes of the second giant. So at least avoid the 3%, right? I mean, get a bit more. Get them back in. By the way, I do not like the disenfranchisement of the Brotherhood supporters. I mean, this is not right. It's not healthy, and it's not stable, and I'm not referring to the leadership or the movement. I'm referring to citizens who are supportive or were supportive. I mean, disenfranchising that big bloc does not do us any good. The bloc, the voters. So approach one is get that man, right? And the name I see in circulation is Sami Anan. The second approach is get a candidate to run against President Sisi, a candidate, an opposition candidate who can appeal to the same constituency of Mr. Sisi. And here's Ahmed Shafiq. Because Ahmed Shafiq appeals to the army, appeals to the military security complex, appeals to the state bureaucracy, appeals to Mr. Sisi voters. So get some contestation from within the same ruling establishment, right? And of course, behind that is, so in political science, you have great literature on cracks within autocratic ruling establishments, right? I mean, there are autocratic ruling establishments which go right or go left depending on which group gets the upper hand. So trying to redesign the balance of power within the ruling establishment, this is not about opposition from outside. This is about opposition from within, using the elections as a vehicle, to do that contestation within the ruling establishment. So the third is I can even add four while going. So, but I will stick to three and then maybe it comes up in the debate. The third is get a true opposition candidate from outside. So Khaled Ali, or Mahsoum Marzouk, or Hisham Geneina. And Hisham Geneina, some were arguing, including myself, and I believe in a previous discussion with Said, an informal discussion, is Hisham Geneina would be a great fit because he was in the state bureaucracy. I mean, they know him, he knows them. One of the great criticisms which you get to face as an opposition candidate in a place like Egypt is, do you know anything about that state you're going to manage? Do you know how to run the daily business of the state bureaucracy? And this is a bloody, tough daily business. It takes time to understand. So getting someone from within was always an option. I mean, looking even at Eastern and Central European countries, this was always a case. I mean, getting someone from as a transitional presidency or prime ministership. So three approaches and the names attached to them. I believe Walid is right. It should not be about who is better qualified, be it that better qualification is measured ideologically, politically, or whatever. It should be, the question should be, who can get us closer to the 15%, to the benchmark. So define your wish for result. If it is a 15%, who is going to get us closer to it? A different way of looking at it, which is legitimate, and this is a real debate, and we have to be patient about it, is if we say it's not about the result, it's about the battle.
Yeah.
Right? So the question becomes, who can stage a better battle?
Yeah.
So is it candidate 1, which would be positioned to claim the votes of the second giant? Or is it candidate 2, who will be positioned within the ruling establishment to contest, but based very much on the same discourse, by the way? Or is it the true opposition candidate coming from outside, staging the battle? My personal preference is to number 3. But in my personal preference, I'm not focused on the result. I believe the battle is what we can control. So that creation of the we, the better organization, is subject to how good the battle is, how clear the battle is. But once again, we are in debate in different ways, and it takes time. But these are the 3 approaches I see unfolding about the candidate. Well, I believe those who are pushing forward someone like Sami Hanan the calculation is, once again, I mean, his potential voters are supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, and this would be basically getting them out of the disenfranchisement since 2013. The second name, the second approach, and the names associated to it, it would be basically a contestation within the same voting blocks of Mr. Sisi. So if 40% of the electorate participated and Mr. Sisi won 90% plus, it would be to basically get some contestation within that 40%, within that voting block of Mr. And the third is capitalizing on bringing in those of us who boycotted the last time. I boycotted last time, you boycotted last time, probably most of us called for boycott last time. And then we were, I mean, physically you say, voluntarily disenfranchised. So getting us out of that voluntary disenfranchisement and bringing us back in. So it depends on which approach we're looking at. I believe the result is highly important. The battle is important too. By the way, I'm convinced that you can, especially because I'm considering the need to put forward 2 sets of conditions, election process related and wider political conditions. You need a fundamental opposition discourse to address these 2 sets of conditions. If you drop the fundamental opposition discourse, you will end up not addressing more than the election-related conditions: transparency, oversight, monitoring, observation, and so on and so forth. Airtime. So it depends on where you go. So it's like a chain of questions. I'm not convinced as of now that it has to be one opposition candidate. In fact, I was never convinced by that. Sort of the need to bring in different opposition actors in one front, and that one front to push forward one candidate. I'm well aware of the criticism against the background of the presidential elections 2012 and scattering the vote and so on and so forth. However, you cannot force the creation of one front if you really have different actors on the ground. I mean, to me, it's not a meaningful process, and it always backfires. And in Egypt, we have a long track record of nominally announced unified opposition platforms ending up very rapidly in complete fiasco and leading to undermining the opposition spectrum itself. So I would rather go for a plurality of candidates, in total getting close to the 15%, if we agree on it as a realistic result. And since we are not in it to basically win the 55%, we can be relaxed about it. It's really about getting, if we decide that maybe running different candidates would mobilize more, would get us closer to 15%, fine. I mean, it's easier in the presidential elections than in the parliamentary election because there seats, a few more seats can matter. So, I mean, this is different. Secondly, so plurality of candidates is where I place my bet. Secondly, does it, so can we, around the big event of the election, so can we use the event, even if boycotting, to better organize? So it's a yes and no. So I was pushing in that direction the last time, in the presidential elections. But if you monitor what happened in Egypt in the last presidential elections, it was boycott, meaning stay home. There were no events. So I went myself, and I remember with some labor activists to meet labor activists and to convince them. One of the independent labor unions in Egypt is اللقاء الديمقراطي. So the democratic, so a group of independent labor unions in an alliance called the Democratic Meeting. So I went and I met activists, and this was a great meeting, a public meeting in Hilwan, and so the turnout was great organized. The turnout was less than 50. No one. It's very difficult to bring across that message of why we boycott. We're calling for come and hear us about how to organize and get more of affirmative action platforms forward. We do not have good experiences in that in Egypt, realistically speaking, which is why I do not feel it's easy to do. I'm not ruling it out. I mean, theoretically, it's a great possibility. So yes, theoretically, but on the ground, I found it very difficult to do. But what needs to be looked at is what kind of affirmative action platforms we would like to put forward. And this is a social fabric which lends itself to that. I mean, the trouble is, and this is part of the debate many of us have been through, I find it completely frustrating that between 2013 and today, the only real mobilization effort of the Egyptian opposition came against the background of a foreign policy issue, the two-island deal. That there was nothing which was done seriously in relation to human rights issues, in relation to liberties and freedoms, or in relation to social and economic measures. Be it tackling government policies such as a new administrative capital or what have you, or looking at the details of the IMF deal. This is a social fabric which lends itself to affirmative action platform. But instead of that, you see an opposition acting in opposition to the regime in exactly the same populist manner. And so I'm not going to burden you with a debate which I was part of in Egypt. It's frustrating for me, and I believe it will take us nowhere. So we need to make that part of the discussion. What kind of affirmative action, and what comes across easier to citizens? I mean, once again, I look at websites of political parties regularly. None of them puts forward, and these pieces of information are announced. So the central bank announces them. So why, for example, why don't they put forward basic information about poverty, inflation, and that's, I mean, just to attract attention, to make citizens conscious of the fact that we had in the beginning of 2017 over 35% inflation rate. Now, according to the central bank, it's around 20%. But if you go by commodity, you get a very different picture. The poverty rate is moving beyond 35%. Unemployment rates are on the rise among young people. So why don't they create some awareness of that? So yes, I mean, this is a discussion we need. And therefore we shouldn't, therefore I'm saying, whoever wants to boycott, fine. Whoever wants to participate, fine. Let's not waste our time in making bad blood about that, and focus on platforms. Egypt should not be reduced, the social fabric and its economic and social realities should not be reduced to the democracy lens. It's only one lens. A second lens is how functional, how stable the state is and its public institutions. How vibrant private institutions are. And therefore, for example, when we criticize the huge and heavy hand of the ruling establishment in the economy, and so, I mean, you are criticizing it because it really undermines the vibrant nature of the private sector to help. I mean, we are living in a place where you cannot imagine this country. You cannot imagine its successful organization or managing different crises without that permanent active setting in which public and private institutions contribute. So you have the democracy lens, you have an institutional lens, and I take very seriously as a political scientist the fact that Egypt's institutions, public and private, are not in the best of shapes. I mean, there are signs of weakness, clear weakness. So, thirdly, there are issues which need to be looked at from a political agent perspective. And in that perspective, you do not wait for catastrophic events to happen and say, well, I'm going to come in and get the result I'm looking for. Political agents are agents of action. This is why they are agents of action. I mean, someone of course, I mean, this is a highly legitimate choice. I mean, so I'm ignoring that place. Fine. But this cannot be the strategy used by actors on the ground. If you are organized in a political party, if you are organized in an opposition spectrum, you cannot say, I'm going to sit back and wait for the catastrophe to unfold. You have to engage, maybe to avoid that catastrophe, as you were saying.
The majority was engaging before. You know what happened to the majority.
Yeah, but once again, I mean, my point of view is we cannot sit back and relax and say, well, let's wait until it collapses.
So we'll repeat the story.
Well, it's the way I see it. We have to try, we have to keep trying until we get better results.
Yes, but in a similar situation, the change became by different characteristics.
We can always agree or disagree on that. My question is, can we afford to sit back and let events in Egypt go to a direction where you are saying, well, it's going to collapse in 2 years? Whatever. I mean, I'm just using that word. I believe this is not the way I see my role or my position or my reading of the situation. If I can engage to avoid collapse, I would love to do it, because this is a country which I care about, and I would like to push it away from the disastrous situation it's in, socially, economically, and politically. So if I can engage to add to the potential of fixing the problems, I would. If I can engage to get in the hope of getting better results, I do it, realistically, knowing that you cannot change a country which has been living in an authoritarian rule since the 1950s in a few years. It takes time. These are long-term processes. And every inch you win does matter. Every single step you make does matter. Politics is not about revolutionary, drastic change every time. These events are scarce, do not happen frequently. What happens in politics frequently is gradual change, step-by-step change. It's what I believe in. We can disagree. Finally, I'm really, I mean, you know, personally, I do not buy into that type of discourse where, I'm not saying you said it, I'm just sort of taking what you said to push it a step forward. I believe that type of discourses, sort of anticipating a catastrophe, anticipating a collapse, anticipating a crisis, and saying, well, what we can do is to wait until that happens, and then we see. It's flawed at two levels. One, which we actually did see a bit of that between 2011 and 2013. No, not the way you're saying it. No. I believe opposition actors were not prepared to use the democratic opening, which happened between 2011 and 2013, because they lacked engagement before. And those who were prepared, and no one read it. I mean, so why was it that the Brotherhood were able to win that much in referendums and elections right after 2011? Because they were in that semi-authoritarian, semi-pluralist tight process since the 1980s, in and out of it. They knew how to participate in it. Other actors did not. So what we had was a plurality of actions, discourses, and platforms not yielding any results. So the first assumption, which is to my mind wrong, about waiting and let's step back and see what will happen, we will not be prepared when that scenario unfolds. We will not be able to use it. And you will end up moving from segment A in the ruling establishment to segment B in the ruling establishment, which is exactly what we are living in. And everyone else is sidelined. The second wrong assumption, to my mind, is politics is about people's lives, about their livelihood. And I'm not here to push forward any humanist values, but I find that for countries which we care about, for be it the home country or any other country we happen to care about, it's very difficult to agree to that notion of as if it's a game of wait and see. This is not how you manage societies. These are great misery and great suffering is related to that. So personally, I cannot buy into that discourse. Let's get some figures in place. I mean, membership of political parties, of all political parties, of the 100 plus political parties in Egypt, does not exceed 5% of the Egyptian electorate. I mean, what kind of representation do political parties in Egypt have? Big question mark. So, operating legal political parties as of now, their membership does not exceed 5% of the electorate. So, which means that 95% of the electorate is outside of political parties. So, second, when you look at the three patterns I was referring to, the three patterns of activism in Egypt since 2013, only one of them has been pushed forward by political parties. And the most successful, in the sense of vibrant, active political parties, are parties where we have non-party activities and non-party platforms making the rounds, like Dustur and Al-Aisha Khurriya and Strong Egypt, Masraf Qawi. As of now, they have very strong presence on university campuses. They bring in that component into parties. Parties in autocratic environments can be highly boring entities. Which is why citizens move away from them. I mean, so what do you get to see? I mean, what do you respect? I mean, gray-haired men, no women, sitting in closed rooms, having mics and cameras, and speaking to mics and cameras. I mean, to whom else do they speak? Very little. They can announce the most revolutionary declaration of all times. So it's reaching to 30 people in attendance, or 40, or 100 beyond. So there was a big, and I do not mind anyone having it, a big opposition event a few days ago. I mean, I guess التحالف الشعبي was celebrating its being established 5 years ago. And there was a big fiery set of statements coming from opposition politicians. And then I monitored on social media the frequency of retweeting, and very little. I mean, this is a clear indicator. I mean, this is one of the legacies of autocratic environments. Political parties are weak, so we cannot only depend on them. So yes, I mean that any activism in social media or elsewhere outside of party structures is more than needed. Secondly, I'm sometimes, because once again, I mean, Egypt is a place where political parties, in spite of a brief period after 2011, have never been able to participate in open contestation in parliamentary and presidential elections, which is why there is a great deal of capacities which they lack. I mean, parties do not know how to write a meaningful program, how to draft a meaningful platform. They need activism and activists from outside of their structures. And therefore, the most successful of parties between 2011 and 2013, like, for example, the Dustur Party, was based on outside of party structures activism, which is where the energy comes from. And this is what, I mean, with all due respect to party politicians. So, thirdly, political parties you can never rule out the possibility of political parties engaging in sort of not behind closed doors discussions and debates, maybe less in presidential elections than in parliamentary elections. But political parties are basically like profit-making companies. They are after a profit which is set to a number of seats or whatever. Less in presidential elections, but you cannot rule out that parties, you can agree with them on having a platform and having conditions, and then they become too engaged in the process itself, even if it's completely flawed, and stick to it and continue to participate. So you always need to have sort of a reality check from outside of political parties. They get too opportunistic sometimes. Political parties by nature can get too opportunistic sometimes. So you need that in Egypt. So yes, no, of course. I mean, it's, what I'm concerned about is how to get meaningful policy platforms, social, economic, and political issues, primarily centered around the domestic condition. And trying to engage in a manner very different from what you're saying, telling citizens that we can see a different path, yielding better results or less suffering, no matter in which direction. Better results and less suffering, avoiding any big collapses. Only then we can engage. I mean, Egypt is a place where demobilization has been happening very quickly, historically. So when you look at it, I'm looking at Egypt, so there were, who was referring to Kifaya earlier? Union, right? So there was a great phase of cross-ideological mobilization, right? Centered around Kifaya movement in 2004 and 2005. Great wave of mobilization. Then, and it was not only the regime masterminding how to deal with Kifaya, but it was, so the mobilization process itself, so slowing down greatly. So Kifaya, which was front, right, and center in Egyptian politics 2004 and 2005, 2006, 7, and 8 was
going down.
The same happens to the campaign of Muhammad al-Baradei. So Tarq al-Abwab. So once again, great mobilization. Never before, actually the only incident we had in Al-Wafd before 1919, a huge number of signatures collected from citizens in urban and rural places. So you would expect, once again, before 1919, it led to the creation of the most effective in history, of the most effective political party in Egypt, Al-Wafd. I mean, this is by far, sort of textbook-wise, this is the most effective political party we've ever had. That campaign ended, and demobilization was unfolding very quickly. So in fairness, one has to say that this is always a reflection of the repressive apparatus. And they know how to demobilize, right? I mean, you increase the level of repression. I mean, you increase the level of administrative control. You impact different types of punishments. So not only detention, imprisonment, but you target the livelihood of citizens directly. Right? So starving, freezing accounts, whatever. I mean, they are quite creative in how to punish. Right? So demobilization is always a reflection of what the regime does too. But Egypt is a place where waves of mobilization have been hardly followed up by institutional efforts to capitalize on them, creating successful political agents, pushing into getting into political institutions, contesting elections better. So you always risk that. I believe, however, and I have no answer to your question. Unfortunately, it's exactly the situation we've been looking at since 2011, waves of mobilization or points of mobilization followed by less activism, by demobilization, and by depoliticization too. I believe we stand a better chance of mobilizing in the first place by using big events like elections. And then we'll see. I mean, one of the ideas I'm flagging is you should prepare not only for a battle ahead of the election day, but a battle after the election day, which every single serious political actor should be considering. I mean, if you know that you're not going to win, your battle is ahead of the election day and after the election day. And secondly, which we really have to give hope. I mean, one of the most frustrating issues after in 2012, after the constitutional referendum happened for the constitutional draft, was you move up the no vote from 22% to 38%, and then you get out of your way to tell your voters, those who voted no, that we reached nothing, we lost. So why should they stick around then? I mean, if we're going to lose, no matter whether we went to the polling center or not, why should they come out again? So, I mean, we have to give hope, but realistic. I mean, do not go to the 55% sort of, I mean, that we'll never get. Yeah, I saw your hand.
Yeah, I was thinking, is this a lack of political leadership? I mean,
Yeah, part of it.
Yeah.
Of course, part of it. Part of it is lack of leadership. Part of it is lack of so political parties have been, which are in most cases have been responsible for that demobilization, right? So political parties have been in comfort zones in Egypt for a very long time. So they got used to that arrangement of and not leading to any rotation of power or power sharing. So it's partly lack of political leadership. It's the very structure of political parties in Egypt, which is why we need energy from outside of formal politics. And thirdly, it's the huge capacity, and we have to recognize, of the regime to adapt to changing situations, repressive. I mean, they are smart. I mean, they know what to do. I mean, it's not that and they are no longer using a playbook which was used prior to 2011. It's a different playbook which they are using right now. This is where sort of the historical depth of the Egyptian state comes in. They know how to control. And so they are creative in masterminding new situations. So it's probably all of that. And adding that we have always lost a great deal of energy fighting each other and among ourselves about what's right and what's wrong. So why don't we just approach one event without having to settle that question ahead of time? Right or wrong, whatever. Boycott or participate as you wish. Have whatever scenario you may have in mind. Let's just focus on the giant. If you feel boycott is more effective, go and tackle the giant boycotting. If you feel that participation is more effective, go and tackle the giant participating. But do not waste time in internal fighting and making bad blood everywhere, because you disenfranchise more. You disenfranchise more. I mean, what I keep hearing is, and reading, of course, beside demobilization, there's a second layer of depoliticization. So workers and civil servants protested in 2011, 2012, and 2013, and even before, not only for economic and social issues, not only for their salaries and adjustment to inflation rates, but they also protested for freedom of association, freedom of expression. Right now, the protest you get to see is about bread and butter issues, very legitimately. But this depoliticization has happened, so you need to claim those people back. And it's only a big event which can happen. Okay, great. Well, I mean, thank you very much for your great input and comments and questions. And once again, so not in any manner to have the final word. Just once again, I mean, engaging in a debate. So let me start with your last point. Yeah, I mean, very pragmatically, and behind that pragmatic view is, as far as I'm concerned, a moral commitment. I mean, we are in no place to put forward any type of advice to anyone. So not only because we are physically far away, but simply because we are facing a reality which details change constantly. Once again, I was just referring to the great energy capacity of the state to mastermind domestic situations, adding new tools, repressive tools, administrative tools, control tools, and we don't see them. We get to see them later on. But those on the ground get to see them and confront them faster. And so we are in no place morally or pragmatically to put forward advice for participation, for boycott, for take to the street, do not take to the street, what have you. Especially if the cost of doing that has been elevated drastically in recent years. And once again, Egypt is a big country, and if some of us have come to live abroad, there is still a plurality of views and voices represented in the domestic scene, and that needs to be accounted for and recognized too. So sometimes talking from afar helps to raise taboo issues, helps to raise issues which maybe the cost of raising domestically is way beyond anyone's capacity to endure. But that is one case. Otherwise, no, we should really sort of restrain ourselves, I believe. While engaging, but engaging not in, which is in fact to my mind, the better way of engaging. I mean, one does not engage by saying, well, I claim to have the ultimate answers to it all. Coming back to it, we didn't reach what we wanted. We really have to step back and look at it a bit carefully. I mean, it backfired. It backfired big time. We are in a situation worse than what we had prior to 2011. So we need to be a bit modest. So secondly, now that discourse, Walid, is, and of course, you know, I mean, this is part of what I've been doing. I mean, I've been pushing forward self-criticism, and we need to recognize where we did wrong, where we did bad, where we didn't get what we wanted, where we were too naive, where we were too vested in ideological debates between Islamists and secular groups to later on for the whole process to be hijacked by someone else, and so we need that. But does such a discourse help in presidential election campaign? I doubt. I mean, you cannot get out of your way to tell someone, and you're running, try to convince her or him to vote for you, that we failed. I mean, why should he or she come and vote for you? I mean, what guarantee do they have that you will not fail again? I mean, it's honest. And for a message to resonate in election times, even in autocratic environments, you need that message of hope. So I do not remember the title of the documentary on the Chilean presidential elections. It's No. I guess the title is No, because the campaign was No, which ended up pushing Pinochet out of power and opening up the system. You need a message of hope, not a message of failure. So tools. Now this is the most tough question, of course, when you look at the coming days. So what do we have? I mean, we have very little. You're right, because this is a government, a ruling establishment which has come to own the place. Media, the economy is in pro-regime hands. Formal politics is you have a parliament which sees itself as an extension of the executive branch of government. You have a plurality. In fact, you create a great deal of. It's an old tool, but it's meaningful for autocratic regimes. You have pro-government political parties and opposition political parties, so citizens end up not knowing who is who, which is why should we differentiate? I mean, this is sort of the effect in the end, the level of literacy and different details from Egypt. Number 5, they own a discourse, and so we should not undermine that. This is a government which has a discourse that resonates, a message which resonates with Egyptians. I mean, they say, well, the message of fear-mongering, let's not push Egypt to a similar situation like Iraq, Syria, or Libya, or Yemen, or what have you. Or this is a message of, well, trust us, civilian politicians and political parties will not bring you bread and butter to your dining tables. And both of them resonate against events which citizens are aware of. There is a message of security comes first, war on terrorism. There is a message of we are the ultimate guarantor of keeping the Egyptian state operational, and so on and so forth. So they have a message, and they are popular, so they have their constituencies. So what do we have? Right now we don't have a message, so we badly need a message. Secondly, we need a message, I believe, forcing unity on a fragmented opposition spectrum will not do it. Let's recognize our fragmentation and diversity and get each segment to have a convincing message. Affirmative action while boycotting, pushing for conditions while participating, having someone like competing with Sisi over the same constituencies. So we need a message, and related to the messages, we need to, before that, I guess we need to recognize the diversity we're facing in the opposition spectrum and moving away from sort of that dichotomies of good and evil. We're not good and they are not evil. It's too simple. This is not what we're looking at. So recognize the diversity, develop a convincing message. I guess because it's presidential elections, we need to settle on candidates soon to start to build a profile, public profiles. Finally, we have to outline the entry points we have. We have entry points in social media. But we do have entry points in the labor movement. We have entry points on on university campuses. And this is one of the conditions, if the campaign of whatever علشان تبنيها whatever it's called, was in university campuses throughout the last weeks collecting signatures of faculty and admin staff and students, I mean, we should make an issue of, well, we would like to have the same access as well. Whether they give it to you or not, but at least limit the space. I mean, figure out entry points beyond the usual suspects. So we have social media entry points, but we have, of course, political parties and press conferences they do, as less effective as they are, but we do have entry points elsewhere, in the labor movement, in the student movement, in professional associations, and so on and so forth. 4, we have, and here too we can sort of come up with creative ideas on how to bridge the gap, the urban-rural divide. Most of the political actions which unfolded in Egypt since 2013 from an opposition perspective were centered in urban places. So Cairo, Alexandria. Now the majority of Egyptians of the electorate happens to live outside of urban places. So we need to figure out a way. We have one of the conditions I dream of campaigns making is access to rural areas, that we have to agree. I mean, one of the conditions can be a detailed set of public events happening in each governorate. We need to reach beyond our usual clientele. Can we get it or not? I'm not sure, but at least make an issue of it. But to come to an honest answer, we have very little. We have very, very little. Which is why exaggerating sort of the potential outcome will not do. Putting forward a set of huge conditions will not do, because then we will face a position of they are not met. So what do we do now? Do we run or do we boycott? So I guess it's tough. It's very, very tough because we don't have much, but it's a question for actors on the ground to figure. And they will have to figure very soon what they are operating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.